I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Gemma Masson, and forgive me if I read this out, I haven't committed it to memory. But this is a very interesting bio. Gemma Masson is an Associate Fellow of the Higher Education Academy, a PhD graduate from the Centre for Byzantine, Ottoman and Modern Greek Studies. She currently works as the Assistant Editor of the Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations Journal at the University of Birmingham. She has diverse research interests, including Ottoman history, imperial and global history, history and popular culture, Dracula history, supernatural history, mythology, folklore, and death. What can we say after that? So, her institutional affiliations include the British Institute at Ankara, the Transylvanian Society of Dracula, British Society for Middle Eastern Studies, Ottoman Turkish Studies Association, British Association for Turkish Area Studies, the Anglo-Turkish Society, in which we have also held joint events, the British Association for Islamic Studies, the Folklore Society, and Travellers in Ottoman Lands. So if Gemma doesn't know about it, I'm not sure anybody does. Anyway, I'm delighted to welcome you to give your talk. Afterwards we'll have questions. We have an online audience as well. So if you are online and would like to ask a question or make a comment, please put it in the chat and we will pick it up and voice it to everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Quentin. Good evening, everyone. Everyone in the room and everyone joining us on Zoom. I can't see you, but I hope you can see me. I'd like to thank the Byzantine Heritage Foundation and the Anglo-Turkish Society for inviting me to speak to you, and also echo Quentin's thanks to the Royal Asiatic Society for hosting us in this very beautiful venue. I'm very jealous. So, the title of my paper, I hope will become apparent. The upstairs, downstairs is not simply me showing how old I am by a reference to an ancient sitcom, although I was raised on that generation of sitcoms. You can blame my grandparents. But is supposed to encapsulate the range of different perspectives I'm hoping to present on the British diplomatic experience in the Ottoman Empire. So, very generally, the 18th century in the Ottoman Empire was marked by a shift in the methods of international interaction. So there is a lot less warfare and a lot more trade and diplomacy. So a shift from hard power to soft power, if you're familiar with that sort of dichotomy. While such interactions did exist prior to the 18th century, they are very well documented. It was in the 1700s that they really became the primary currency of international relations by the Ottoman state. This brought a great number of Europeans to Istanbul in various diplomatic roles as opposed to leisure or business, and it has led to some extensive collections of primary literature detailing the experiences and observations of these travellers. Now, there is a temptation to be very rigid in our classification of who constitutes a diplomatic traveller, and as such, historians can be tempted to limit themselves to only the ambassadors themselves, the official dispatches, the correspondence and diaries. However, I want to take a bit of a wider perspective and say the definition of a diplomatic traveller can and should be extended to include the family, the staff and the whole retinue and household of the ambassadors. So it's this classification I'm going to be working with this evening. With that in mind, I've chosen to present three very different travellers here, all of whom came to Istanbul in the 18th century as part of three different diplomatic households. My aim here is to try and show that members of the diplomatic household still had an experience that was dictated by that diplomatic status, by that affiliation, no matter what rank in the household they held. So they can overlap with being qualified as other travellers. Obviously we've got women's travel for the women of the household, etc. But there are also valuable contributions to be made to diplomatic history and diplomatic travel history from these other sources. So, secondly, I hope to illustrate the information on diplomatic life in Istanbul can be gathered from other members of the household, as I've said. The experiences of these other members can show different facets, both of the diplomatic experience and of the Ottoman Empire as a whole, and it might not be considered obvious or noteworthy to the ambassadors themselves. So, just a word about diplomatic history. Recent trends have begun to move in this broadening direction. This has been occasioned by the rise of the new diplomatic history. This advocates an interdisciplinary approach to the study of diplomacy. However, according to the scholar John Watkins in 2008, the focus of this new diplomatic history was very much on the modern era and was unable to accommodate studies of pre-19th century diplomacy. And this is a point which was addressed by the Network for New Diplomatic History, which was founded in 2011, and their website clearly states, although most of our own work is in the modern era, we are open to scholars with any chronological and geographic experience. This is something which I believe will be remedied in its own time. We all know most historical trends begin being showcased within the specialism of whichever scholar has identified that trend. The importance of diplomatic history as a field of study was addressed in a rather exciting 2009 back and forth in the Journal of American History. Thomas Zeiler wrote a piece called The Diplomatic History Bandwagon, in which he argued the presence of the state is central to any study of history. This was contradicted by Jessica Guinard-Hecht in her rebuttal, "What bandwagon?" She's not convinced that state and power are necessarily the keys to good research in any field. She does argue that while studying the power of the state is important, it should never be the exclusive domain of diplomatic history. And new scholarship does and can open new areas of inquiry not shaped by the power of the state. Now, I applaud her position, I do, and love the idea of opening up new avenues of exploration. But it's something I personally find difficult to apply in the Ottoman case, because my experience with Ottoman primary sources is that most of them are created by the state and state institutions. If you go into the archives in Istanbul, you will see that this is the case. So we can get a very top-down model of history if we're not careful. Historians do need to spend quite a bit of time reading between the lines and sort of looking for those double meanings in the archival material, and more importantly, setting it in its proper context. Most recently, this new diplomatic history was applied to the 18th century Ottoman Empire by Michael Talbot in a 2017 book that came from his thesis, and I do recommend that. I very much enjoyed that book. And in it, Talbot examines the practices of European diplomats. He places at the centre of his work the interconnectivity of law and finance in diplomatic practice. This is no surprise at all, because the British Embassy in Istanbul was very deeply connected to, and indeed under the sponsorship of, the East India Company, and instilled in its post holders the necessity of protecting British trade and financial interests. So this question of the ambassador, was he an agent of the company or was he an agent of the crown? And this was something that caused contention in earlier periods between monarchs and merchants. So the Calendar of State Papers from the 17th century shows Charles I commenting that he did not like the company assuming that their chosen candidate for the role of ambassador, in that case it was Sir Thomas Roe, would be appointed. And this is Charles trying to assert his royal authority. I'm the king, he represents me, not you. He's my ambassador. Now, Charles I did like his divine right king's absolute power, so we have to consider that as well. However, Talbot looks at the capitulations granted to the British merchants to see if they can be in any way differentiated from those granted to French and Dutch merchants, and he sees no very great differences. Regardless, the protection and maintenance of these rights was always considered paramount for British ambassadors. So the Ottomans, for their part, had what we may view an unconventional approach to diplomacy. The first Ottoman ambassador was resident in London only in 1793, and in general the Ottomans did not recognise the equality of other sovereignties. This unilateral model of integration was a power move, and the ambassadors could be used as political hostages if the need ever arose. There was a tendency to imprison rather than exile foreign diplomats in times of trouble, and this harkens back to the 15th century and one of my other areas of interest, when the Ottomans took the sons of a rebellious regional prince, took the two younger sons to the court as political hostages of assurance of their father's continued good behaviour. I'm not sure if you've heard of this guy, but he was one of them. So that is Dracula, Vlad Dracula, aka the Impaler. It was he and his younger brother, Radu, spent time at the court of Sultan Murad, and indeed spent time in school with and were classmates of the prince who would later become Mehmed II. But that's just something I like to try and slip into wherever I can, because I find him very interesting. Regardless, G.R. Berridge argues that the Ottoman Empire was fully integrated before the end of the 18th century, though the absence of Ottoman ambassadors overseas, I think, makes this interpretation a little problematic, because there is a definite imbalance of power. This suited the Ottomans for the leverage it gave them, and ironically, the Europeans were very happy with this, as long as they were granted the rights they sought. The English Secretary of State, especially, often preferred to conduct negotiations via diplomats in foreign capitals. This came to be called the English Plan. It was actually given a name, and that broadened the political responsibility of British ambassadors. Regarding the European diplomatic situation in Istanbul, the English diplomatic experience largely consisted of opposing the French influence. If France wanted it, we wanted to stop them getting it, basically. As France did enjoy long-standing good relations with the Ottomans, and they were the historical enemy of Britain. However, the Ottomans were getting increasingly suspicious of French political motivation.
Recording stopped.
So that made opposing French influence easier for the British. Coupled with the British-Turkish alliance of 1799 to expel France from Egypt and the British role as mediator, it appeared that Britain was gradually assuming the role that France previously held as protector of the Ottomans. There was also a concern that French diplomacy would be used to export revolutionary ideas overseas to the East, which was something that the Ottomans didn't want, and it was something other European powers didn't want, because the Ottomans were a useful ally against the up-and-coming and very young French Republic. So, my view, and this has been my opinion since way back in my master's days, European powers did use the Ottoman Empire as a diplomatic battleground where they could stage their little shows of one-upmanship safely away from their own power centres and resources. So, my three case studies. My first traveller is an ambassador I'm going to look at, and whose dispatches focus greatly upon the international relations of other nations with each other and with the Ottomans. Sir Robert Sutton, born 1671 or 2, educated Trinity College in 1688 and Middle Temple in 1691. 1691 also saw him inherit property upon the death of his father. However, he was far from wealthy, so he became a deacon and then a chaplain to his cousin, and travelled with his cousin when he became ambassador to Vienna. The cousin became ambassador. That was in 1694. He abandoned his church career when he was appointed as a secretary to the embassy in Vienna, and Sutton then went on to become a career politician and diplomat, appointed to Istanbul in the early 18th century, serving there from 1702 to 1717, and he was knighted a year before his arrival in Istanbul. He served with distinction, and his writings have always been considered extremely accurate and to have acute analytical prowess. He was aided in his work by his skill in both Latin and Italian, both of which were very important languages of diplomacy at that time. In 1717, he was a mediator in the Austro-Turkish peace, and he was rewarded for his performance there by being given the coveted Paris appointment. Returning to England, he worked his way up the political ranks, he married, was appointed to the Privy Council, a meteoric rise. However, his career was not to be spotless, in 1725, the same year he became KCB, he was also on the committee of the Charitable Corporation, and they had a significant scandal in 1732. Basically, money is meant to go to charity. This scandal was so significant that in 1733, some printers actually published a pamphlet entitled An Apology for Sir Robert Sutton. From then on, he was a bit more quiet in his political career, and he died in 1746. So the sources I've been using for this talk is evidence from the dispatches of Sutton as prepared by Professor Actes Curat for the Camden series of the Royal Historical Society. So when he looks at the dispatches, Professor Curat, in his introduction, defines Sutton as being not pro-Turkish and somewhat inclined to present a more unfavourable picture of the Ottomans than was actually true. Considering that Sutton received his salary through the company and it was not always consistently paid, it's likely that some frustration with his circumstances made him a little grumpy, and maybe that bled over into his work, and I'm actually really tempted to say he's hangry, given the Snickers. However, his income was supplemented by money paid to him by the Russian Tsar in exchange for his mediation between Russia and the Ottoman court. And a great deal of Sutton's writing concerns not only British relations with the Ottomans, but the relations of every country. In 1710, he dedicates a great deal of time and space to discussing the movements of the King of Sweden. Now, this is a bit of a saga. Charles XII of Sweden was at this time in exile, who was being hosted by the Ottoman court after the fall of his empire to Russia in 1709. The then Ottoman Valide Sultan, or Queen Mother as we call her, convinced her son, who was Ahmed III, to go to war with Russia on behalf of the exiled Charles, and this led to the Krupp River campaign of 1710 to 1711, and you see a map of the various military movements there. This, as well as the mediating role of ambassadors, is borne out in Sutton's writing. On the 8th of December 1710, he describes a meeting with the Ottoman Sultan and Ahmed. And the Sultan seems to have expected Sutton to be presenting proposals on behalf of the Muscovites. When this proved not to be the case, the Sultan then felt free to express how frustrated he was with the Russians and his intention that the Ottoman army should engage them in conflict. Sutton takes great pains to describe the individual players of these games and the tensions between them. And he is nothing if not diligent in his writing, apologising when there was a delay in his sending dispatches because of an illness he suffered. And he stated that as he has no dragoman or secretary of the Turkish war camp, he cannot verify all of the information he's sending. So these details show how importantly Sutton took his role as a career diplomat. It's the kind of polish and attention to detail you don't always see among lesser qualified ambassadors. On a lighter note, there is something Sutton has in common with other British diplomats, as previously mentioned. Anyone with even a passing familiarity with European history will know, it is a truth universally acknowledged, that a British ambassador must be in want of an excuse to mock the French. Sutton got his chance in September 1712. He wrote to Lord Dartmouth of the futility of the French ambassador's efforts to persuade the Sultan to break current alliances. My second traveller is one who should be very familiar, at least to the Anglo-Turkish Society, and I'm sure to a lot of other people as well. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. Born May 1689 as Mary Pierpoint, she had a comfortable upbringing, a fine education, and soon became a prolific writer. And she married Edward Wortley Montagu in 1712. It was this marriage eventually brought her to London. She became part of intellectual society there, and many of her closest friends also belonged to this group, and they would be the recipients of her letters, which she sent back from Turkey. So these friends include Alexander Pope, Abbe Conti, as well as several well-to-do ladies of the upper class. Her decision to accompany her husband on his embassy to Istanbul is a sign of her support and loyalty to him. Edward had married Mary despite the fact she did not have a dowry, so she was extremely grateful and felt very beholden to him for the rest of her life. This could also explain why she was willing to just up her life and travel across the globe with him. Another plausible reason is a little less selfless. While she was suffering from smallpox in 1715, someone, and we still don't know who, had circulated the satirical court eclogues she had penned from her experiences and friendships with members of the court and the literati. And these were people who did not like you making fun of them or taking the mickey. So she was in a bit of disgrace, shall we say. So it's understandable that an extended sabbatical overseas was appealing to her at this point. Whatever the reasons, she made the most of her experiences, sending home long letters describing her travels and keeping copies for later reworking into a travel book. I'm sure many of us know Life on the Golden Horn as her most popular publication. She educated herself in Turkish culture. She pursued studies of language, literature, religion, and social customs. During her time in Istanbul, which she referred to as Constantinople in her writings, Lady Mary seems to have been determined to explore and absorb as much of the culture there as she could. Also, as a woman, she was granted access to areas of Ottoman society that European male travellers could not. For example, she would visit with the Ottoman ladies in their harems and her households. Though Lady Mary's best-known work, Life on the Golden Horn, does present her experiences in an accessible manner, it is an edited-down version of her complete writings, so I'm using this version of the Turkey Embassy letters, which is a bit longer and has a bit more to get into. And through this, I want to highlight her experience as a diplomatic wife, with both the limitations and freedoms she enjoyed, which were not open to her husband. And if anyone is interested in British diplomatic women in the Ottoman Empire, I can recommend Katie Hickman's book, Daughters of Britannia. Katie Hickman herself was the daughter of a diplomat and spent her childhood moving around with her family as her father got posted, so she has a bit of an insight into what she's writing about. But back to Lady Mary. As a prolific writer, she recorded every single leg of her journey to and from Istanbul, as well as her time in the city itself. However, in the interest of time, I'm just going to take examples of her work from her residence in the city itself. Lady Mary's first impressions of the city were a little muted. She states she was being so busy receiving visitors, she did not have time to explore as she wished. And she writes to Abbe Conti on the 29th of May, 1717, I've got a nice big quote here, "Our palace is in Pera, which is no more a suburb of Constantinople than Westminster is a suburb of London." Oh look, all my typos right there. Ib, a suburb of London. All the ambassadors are lodged very near each other. One part of the house shows us the port, the city, and the Seraglio, and the distant hills of Asia. A certain French author says that Constantinople is twice as large as Paris. Mr. Wortley is unwilling to own it is bigger than London, though I confess it appears to me to be so. So, generally positive, it's a big place, we've got nice views. She knows she's being put in very close proximity to the other Europeans. She notices that, and she's also, most importantly, explaining her impressions of the city in ways that the people back home could understand. You know, let me compare it to London, let me compare it to, you know, Pera to Westminster in ways that would really make it very clear to them. So she's, you know, she's noticing it. She seems to be warming to the city right away, but she's a little unrestricted. She's not aware of how restricted her access is yet. She talks about, again, how they live in Pera, which was a clever way on the part of the Ottomans to keep all the diplomats in one part of the city and to also make them feel, make the visitors feel more comfortable being surrounded by other Europeans, by more familiar than they might find in other neighbourhoods. However, Lady Mary was determined to see more of the city and see if she would. By donning Turkish dress, she found herself able to move around the city with a considerable degree of freedom and devoid of harassment, for, she says, they dare not be rude to a woman. And I do like to think of her as a sort of Ottoman flaneurs, a woman just walking around the city wanting to take in its atmosphere and its culture and really wanting to interact with the place. She comments that she finds the Turkish veil perfectly comfortable and claims that, if it was not, I should be content to endure some inconvenience to content a passion so powerful with me as curiosity. That curiosity results in very detailed descriptions of the city and its customs, which she sends back. She often highlights how the reality is unlike the rumours they hear about the Ottomans. So this shows that Lady Mary might have had preconceived notions from the contemporary Orientalist tendencies. She had heard the stereotypes, maybe she believed them, that she is very open to explore and find out for herself and to educate others. However, Lady Mary does acknowledge that Ottoman women had very little independent use of public spaces, with the exception of the women's bathhouses. Never one to miss an opportunity to experience something, Lady Mary recorded that while she was attending a bathhouse, she had the opportunity to see a Turkish bridal party arrive. She talks about the ceremonies which went on there in detail and concludes her observations of Turkish women with the opinion, "You may believe me that the Turkish ladies have at least as much wit and civility, nay liberty, as ladies amongst us, so they're not all these meek little mice of women that some people might imagine." And indeed, the contemporary Orientalists maybe fetishize Eastern women to be. Like, no, they've got some chutzpah, they've got some attitude when they need it. Turkish styles of dress and bathing were not the only customs Lady Mary found herself participating in. Observing Ottoman women with their families, she did record that the value of a woman is greatly enhanced by the number of children she has, and it seems to be customary for women to be always producing children. She writes to her friend Anne Thistlethwaite in January 1718 that the French ambassadress is forced to comply with this fashion as well as myself. She's been here not much above a year and has lain in once and is big again. And it seems that the European women were looked down on by the Ottoman population should they not be evidently producing children. Lady Mary herself did give birth to her daughter during her time in Istanbul. And her approach to such large families was to ask how were so many children supported. And the Ottoman women informed her that due to a high mortality rate, it was unlikely that many of the children were going to survive to adulthood. So, this is one Turkish custom Lady Mary does not believe she could easily adapt to. And the climate is another one. She records on several occasions how, because she's accustomed to British weather, she finds that Ottoman heat is too much for her. It's not the only admission into the company of Ottoman ladies that she gains. But, sorry, let me start that again. Lady Mary petitioned to be able to go into St. Sophia, or Hagia Sophia, and she was very confused as to why this was so much administrative work, why this was such a task. She says, I can just walk into any other mosque in the city, and actually, a lot of those mosques, she says, please her more from an architectural perspective than Hagia Sophia did. Now, if we bear in mind that Hagia Sophia was built as a church, not a mosque, but still, she seems to enjoy the traditional Ottoman architecture. She also recounts crossing the Bosphorus with delight as she takes in the scenery and visiting the stately homes of the viziers. And if you've ever crossed the Bosphorus on the ferry in Istanbul, you'll know that it's absolutely the best thing you can do. And I never got tired of it. I lived there for a year, and my daily commute was to get the ferry from Kadıköy across to the other side, and I could still do it every day. It's just the best thing. Lady Mary describes in great detail the home of the late Grand Vizier, which she visited in 1718, and she talks about the beauty of the building and its decor. But it couldn't last forever. In May 1718, she writes that she is now preparing to leave Constantinople, and perhaps you will accuse me of hypocrisy when I tell you it is with regret, but I'm used to the air here, or I'm suited to the air here, and have learned the language. I am easy here. So, for all the negatives she finds as a woman in Turkish society, she's still very sorry to go. Now, her experience was very different to that of a native Ottoman woman. Don't think it wasn't. She would have the protection that being a foreign woman of the upper class would give her, as well as being part of a diplomatic mission. Upon her return to England, she longingly wrote, "I must be contented with our scanty allowance of daylight, that I may forget the enlivening sun of Constantinople." The same sun she complained that she found hard to bear was then an object of desire once she no longer had it. And she remembers her time in Istanbul with great nostalgia. So, and if anyone else is interested in more Lady Mary, Joe Willett has a new book out that looks at Lady Mary as a scientific pioneer and her work promoting the smallpox vaccine, which I can recommend. So, where's my final source? Now we're going to get the working man's view of diplomatic life in 18th century Istanbul. This is the downstairs part of upstairs downstairs. George Hay, the 8th Earl of Kinnoll, served as British ambassador to Istanbul from 1729 to 1736. But it's not his account I care about. It's that of his butler, one Mr. Samuel Medley. Medley was a devout Baptist, described by his great-grandson as a man of lively wit, sound understanding, great penetration and unaffected piety. He seems to have been known for being very cheerful, for being having extremely strong religious faith, and apparently ended his days in Pontefract. Now, his diary does not cover the entirety of his master's embassy, but begins as follows, and that's just the coat of arms of Kinnoll there for reference. So, Medley's diary. A journal begun this 16th day of October 1733, Tuesday, being the day that completes 4 years since I came on board Mr. Adam's suite at Wapping Newstairs and entered into the retinue of His Excellence, the Earl of Kinnoll, as his storekeeper and chief butler, but at this time groom of the chambers. And those are not typos, those are actually the way it was written. It's actually one of my favourite things about historical sources is when they have this kind of language. I just think it adds a little something. So, the diary shows that Medley did very well in the Earl's service. It covers the years 1733 to 1736. And the full text of the diary was made free available online via the website of Leghini Press. This was after the publication of Nigel and Caroline Webb's book, which you see here, The Earl and His Butler in Constantinople. And it details the embassy from the point of view of Medley. So it was more of a day book than an actual diary. It doesn't have long passages of him talking about his thoughts and feelings about various things, just short daily entries detailing activities undertaken or anything in particular he observed that day. And appropriate to his station in service, Medley maintains absolute discretion in his writing. That doesn't really help us as historians because I want to know what he thought of things. But I can say he probably had views on propriety and was the very sort of model of a manservant from what I can tell. Common records are observations on the weather, noting who Lord Kinnoll dined with and or visited, who was attending church, and what he bought at the market. He will talk about which areas of the city he walks to on a given day. He sometimes mentions something he's seen, like the body of an executed criminal, which is very charming, or a troupe of dervishes performing in the streets. He also maintains friendships with a number of other servants and local tradesmen he mentions doing business with, going walking with and dining with. He makes small mentions of politics, such as whether certain news was considered good or bad to Lord Kinnoll. And there are occasional small household dramas like a fire in the chimney, it's very quickly put out, right alongside any local news he's heard on, say, military matters. Medley seems reluctant to record where he gets his news from, so it doesn't really say if he's reading it in a newspaper or it's, something someone told him in the marketplace, or if it's just servants or gossip. We're not really sure. But another perennial theme is his own health. This man was either a hypochondriac or just really very, very unlucky. He seemed to have all of the illnesses of the day. So, whenever he recovered from gout, which he seemed to get quite often, he was quick to give God the credit, and he would write, "Better in my foot, BBMGG." And this was his own little abbreviation, which would mean, you see here, this was his abbreviation, "Blessed be my good God." BBMGG. So, as we've said, strongly religious person. And he spends quite a lot of time in the English burial ground at Constantinople as well. But his observations of other denominations do leave something to be desired, as he really can't distinguish between Greek Orthodox practices and what he terms popery. I mean, I recommend Nigel and Caroline Webb's book if you're looking for a detailed breakdown and classification of Medi's life. But the impression is very much that he's got his own little world within sort of the larger world of his lordship. It's his job to kind of keep things running behind the scenes and to just do his thing. So the experience within the diplomatic household was at the same time unique to his situation. He would not have made the contacts or visited the certain areas, or maybe even been in Constantinople at all, had he not been a servant of Lord Kinnour. So they were also still very integrated into the fabric of Istanbul life. He goes to the churches, he talks about what he sees in the street, about the local news. So this is a blurred line, and it kind of goes for all of our travellers. Sort of separate but also integral space, where the interactions and activities of these people concerned were in all ways shaped by being part of the diplomatic household. And this applies to many institutions in Ottoman history, where your sort of entire life experience would be defined by your identity of your trade or your faith or something like that. But from the three examples of travellers here, I believe the consensus I come to is that diplomatic travellers, regardless of gender or social rank, underwent a very curated experience, either by their own inclinations or by the design of the diplomatic system. However, the experiences of these travellers in the 18th century are more opened up to the wider Ottoman society than in previous centuries. I think the best example of this would be the writings of Rusbek, which are very popular. And the problem is, he is often cited with very little sort of analysis or critical thinking. People sort of assume that everything was exactly as he wrote it, and in reality, he spent a great deal of his time, if not exactly under house arrest, then being presented deliberately with what the Ottoman court wanted him to see and no more. And he talks about the janissaries that were assigned to him as guards and being more like a kind of Turkish monk and being sort of very humble servants and things like that. Lady Mary also has janissaries and has a rather interesting anecdote with one regarding a pigeon. She wanted pigeon for her dinner and he couldn't find one at the market. And Lady Mary says, in his zeal for my service, the janissary literally dragged the cadi from the marketplace in front of Lady Mary and says, it's his fault there's no pigeons, would you like me to cut off his head? Now, Lady Mary, whether she's being satirical or not, chooses to say, oh, he was just, you know, he just really wanted to get me the pigeon, he was just so loyal, such a servant. I think maybe you just have this janissary going, for God's sake, this foreign woman, she wants a pigeon, there's no, what am I supposed to do? Am I to cut off his head? You know, so you can interpret that however you wish. But yes, our 18th century travellers did have a much more expanded horizon and a freer flow of information. They were still somewhat curated. I mean, you know, we stick them all in Cairo, they have their own little social circle. But it was a stage in the gradual shift towards more active use of diplomacy throughout the 1700s that I referred to earlier. And this new openness allows our travellers from this point onwards to not only describe more of the society they found themselves in, but also to be more accurate in their accounts as time goes on. So to me, this definitely sets up the 1700s as a critical turning point in Ottoman European diplomatic history, and I hope that interdisciplinary studies, which meld diplomatic history with other fields, will be forthcoming. So we need to see them not just part of political history, but also a wider part of the history of travel, and make space for their unique experiences. So these writings can come under women's history, social history, political history, but I'm really very much in favour of making it very interdisciplinary, and that's what I'd like to see open up a bit more in the future. So that's everything from me. Thank you for your attention, and if anyone has any questions, I'll do my best with them.
Thank you very much, Gemma. So, does anyone have a question they'd like to lead off with? Yes.
You mentioned a career diplomat.
Yes.
When was this sort of started? And were these career diplomats appointed, obviously, by the king, not by the East India Company?
Mm-hmm.
And did they have training? Were they given sort of a brief? And they brought their families with them? They obviously were given money.
Yeah.
Would the Ottomans give them accommodation? Because Lady Montagu, some of them went back to the UK, they were broke.
Yeah. No, I mean, there was, once an embassy was set up in Istanbul, you know, that was the house of the ambassador from that country, and they would just kind of sort of,
Like
as far
today,
as I'm aware.
like
Yeah,
today.
as far as I'm aware, yes. In terms of, excuse me, the training for being a career diplomat, I mean, you could enter it, as you say, Robert Sutton entered it via the church. But I think any sort of man who'd been through the education system, who'd been given the grounding in sort of languages and whatnot, you know, a gentleman's education, as it were, and as always with who you know and the right contacts, in Sutton's case his cousin, would be considered qualified. Now I think in Sutton's case he showed an aptitude for it, because it was when he went as chaplain, they noticed he was kind of good at this, so they made him secretary, and he thought, I'm going to do this instead. You know, there's probably a bit more money here than there was in the church. So I think it was kind of a combination of sort of the socio-economic lottery, the education, and kind of, again, who you knew, who your contacts were to get appointed. Oh, yeah, we got a couple of comments in the chat. Oh, okay.
Okay, so any questions from the floor? If not, I have one.
Okay, go ahead.
So clearly, Lady Mary Montagu provided an excellent descriptive account of life and comings and goings. Is there any evidence in her writings that her husband, with the official position, commissioned her to go to the harem of the Grand Vizier and find stuff out?
I mean, I don't think so. I get the impression he shows up kind of every now and then in her writings, you know, we had dinner with so-and-so this evening, or, you know, Mr. Montague says this, but I think it was very, very much under her own volition. I mean, he definitely wasn't the one telling her, you know, go find this and write it because I'm a man and I can't do it. It was very much Lady Mary, you know, being a writer herself, decided that, you know, while she was travelling, you know, while she was here, there was material to be gathered and there was research to be done that could probably inform her writing. So no, I think a lot of it was very much under her own initiative and just curiosity. You know, she didn't like to sit idle, she wanted to be kept busy.
Would these people have gone back to the UK and presented their findings to an illustrious group of people? Like, you know, when people sort of
Just
listen to them, as they did later on, like, you know,
well, I think
Burns and people like that later on in the Victorian period.
Yes.
They had followers that listened to what they had their adventures in it.
I mean, travel literature was its own genre. Usually you'd get, I mean, the women would be, you know, in their houses and in their little salons. It would probably be more of the male travellers who would belong to societies like this and who would go and give the talks. But there is, you know, travel literature was very much its own sort of genre of publication, and a subgenre of sort of ladies' travel literature was opening up. You see it more sort of, again, these things become, there's more of them from the 19th century, particularly with travellers in Egypt. So, you know, think, you know, Amelia Edwards, you know, up the Nile and things like that. Yeah, I don't think that Lady Mary was consciously trying to tap into any kind of larger trend she knew about. I think she was just a writer and here was something worth writing about. And she wanted to stay in touch with her friends. So I think it was a combination of sort of those two things, really kind of wanting to keep contact with her friends who she missed, and thinking, oh, I can probably get a book out of this, a book or two out of this. She never missed an opportunity for anything. So yes, I think in terms of presenting to illustrious companies such as you have here, yes, it would be more of a men's world at that time, unfortunately, but all very grateful that that's changed.
Okay, a question?
So when you're going through the archives in Turkey, did you find anything from the other side, so the Ottoman side, on their views on the diplomats?
Yeah. So mostly because when I went through the archives for my PhD, I was looking for stuff on Janissaries, so I mostly found things with the Janissaries pertaining to their appointment as guards to the international diplomatic households. Now I know the Janissaries themselves weren't always particularly keen on this particular assignment. They didn't like it. They sartorial conventions, I believe, had them wearing yellow shoes, and other Janissaries would call them swine herds because you're herding the foreigners around the place. But I do think the appointment of Janissaries to the diplomats can be seen a couple of ways. Either you're so valued that you must be protected by our legendary, or the Janissaries keep them in line, make sure they only see what they're supposed to see. I'm not 100% sure. As I said, Lady Mary has her anecdote about the Janissary, Roosevelt has his. I also found something to do with coming from the other side, not a European ambassador, but a Persian ambassador, and there was a house to be set up for him from the Ottoman treasury, and no sort of a guard to be sent out to get him. But I think that was during a period, if I remember correctly, of the Ottoman-Safavid conflicts. So that could have been, he needs extra protection, or he's coming to negotiate a peace treaty or something like that. But yes, in general, I think, my Janissaries weren't necessarily 100% so keen, but I think, other people liked Europeans to come and spend their money in the Ottoman Empire, basically. I don't think there's anything in the
Okay, so a question. I was interested that you said that Robert Sutton's salary was paid through
the company.
Through the company. Presumably he had an obligation to protect the company. What about the Levant company? Did he have any obligations to that other trading company?
Not that I'm 100% aware of, because from my readings, I could be completely wrong, but it was mostly the EIC that kind of had this had the means to sponsor the ambassador. So presumably they represented British interests across the empire, which would be all the territories, including the Levant. But I haven't read of any direct connection he had with that company by name. I'd be very interested to hear if anyone else has, actually. But that is worth looking into.
Would Robert Sutton have been a member of the East India Company and perhaps traded on his own account to help supplement his income?
As an employee of the company, I'm not sure. I know he supplemented his income, as I said, from being paid for a role of mediator. But yes, he wasn't particularly wealthy on his own means, which is why he was kind of looking for a career, first in the church and then in diplomacy. So I'm not sure he would have, at least in the early stages, have had the means to be an investor per se. Obviously, later on when he comes back and he's, KCB and he's a member of the Privy Council, it will probably be after his time in Istanbul he would have had the resources to be involved in that way.
Thank you. So, any questions, other questions from the floor? And I have one last question before I start. So,
No worries.
Can you explain the connection between the Ottoman Empire and Transylvania? Just share a little bit of history. And
Okay.
Why?
Okay, because I was that teenager, I liked the vampires, okay? I blame my father. He showed me the interview of the vampire movie when I was 8, so it's his fault really. But no, so I got this interest in the sort of folklore and mythology, which is still one of my areas. And then obviously being into history, I consumed a lot of popular culture that featured history. And that kind of like came to, okay, I read all the vampire stuff, here's Dracula. Oh, hang on, Dracula was actually a historical person and he has some fictional historical novels about him and that's a bit interesting. And then, hold on, what's he got to do with the Ottoman Empire? Because in fact, he, as I mentioned, both he and his younger brother were political hostages in the court of Murad and classmates of Mehmed II. And this interested me because we're seeing a lot more, and in recent years, popular culture showing Dracula less in his vampire persona and more in his historic sort of Romanian prince persona. And I actually do quite a bit of work with a novelist who is writing a series of books about the historical Vlad Dracula, and I do some of the research for him. So yeah, it became kind of, that's how I looked into the Ottomans sort of from that perspective.
And was Transylvania like borderland territory between the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or was it much sort of fought over and changed hands?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, his Vlad's father was and older brother were trying to make alliances they were both members of Order of the Dragon, which was created by the Hungarian king to try and push the Muslim Turkish influence back out of Europe. And Vlad himself would become a member, so that's where kind of his father being Vlad Dracul, the dragon, comes from his membership in this order, and then Dracula is literally just means the son of the dragon, and he also became a member. So yes, it was very contested, and it was very sort of, Vlad was doing a lot of work. I mean, he spends time in prison, he spends time, I believe his second marriage, he marries the Hungarian princess who's a Catholic, which gets him excommunicated by the Orthodox Church, which incidentally is quite fascinating because in vampire folklore, if you were excommunicated, you were at risk of rising as a vampire, and actually Vlad, the historical Vlad, was excommunicated from the Orthodox Church, so that's a little fun snippet. But yes, he, I mean, obviously it's, Romania did become an Ottoman state until early 20th century. I'm not entirely sure when Romania was reclaimed, to be fair. But yes, it was a very much a contested thing because they were trying to push just as far into Europe as possible. And we know they got as far as Vienna, 1683, and then they sort of begin to recede back. I hope that answered your question. I feel like I rambled a bit.
Thank you. So no further questions or comments online.
Thank you, Alison. She said something nice in the chat.
So if there are any more questions from the floor, we will break and we will network.
Let's have a drink.
So,
Okay, I can have wine now, the talk's over.
thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, everyone.